Introduction. I fear that this will be one of those speeches where the room will either ride with me or want to fight me, because ultimately it begins in a brutal and dark reality of which most philosophers are probably already aware. But if the following diatribe possesses a virtue, it is in light of an intent, however poorly executed, to explain a total justification of the risks we take when we embrace the play of liberated thinking. Am I beating the fire alarm? Can you hear me? Okay. The opening darkness relies on the weight and peculiar power of the symbolism of the cross, as it animates the character of this world in lieu of some terrifying truths. Perhaps one of the most famous interpretations of the cross comes from Nietzsche, who criticized it as a perversion, marrying the concept of ultimate cosmological power with the display of irreducible human weakness, a man being tortured and dying alone on a cross, which was merely a common and brutal instrument of Roman punishment. This paradox of the cross, that power is symbolized in weakness, disturbed Nietzsche as the final expression of a nasty strategy of power invented by slaves in Egypt to trick the strong into bowing to the disempowered, which he argued formulated the base of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Reinhold Niebuhr, the American philosopher and theologian who campaigned for a Christian realism which shaped Martin Luther King's own strategy against oppression by inspiring the notion that nonviolent resistance allowed economic coercion to substitute for full-fledged military engagement. This is a run-on sentence, by the way, and thus undermine the legitimacy of an appeal to force by the over-equipped oppressors, evening the playing field of battle by transferring the battle into the economic and ethical terrain, did not find Nietzsche's critique unpalatable. Instead, the Niebuhrian interpretation of the cross is that this marriage of weakness and power is precisely the point. The message of the cross, according to Niebuhr, is that pure love and goodness is crucified in this world. So if you want to be uncynical and embrace a purity of goodness, then you must prepare for ultimate punishment. However, if the cross represents the instinct to kill pure love and goodness, then what does the hemlock consumed by that great midwife to philosophical birth, our beloved Socrates, represent? In my interpretation, it reveals that pure thinking is also murdered in this world. In fact, I would go so far as to speculatively modify Niebuhr's analysis to say the cross itself also symbolizes the murder of pure thought, as it was not merely the goodness of Christ which threatened an empire, it was the intellectual potency and potential for a revolution of the soul which disturbed those in power. Unfortunately, for those of us in this room who believe in a sanctified notion of original thinking, the historical evidence for persecution of thought is ample. Socrates is not alone in his fate, and if I were to attempt to exhaust the list of martyred philosophers, then this speech would go on for an apparent eternity. It might do that anyway. Across cultures and epochs, for reasons ranging from heresy to treason, thinkers are often subdued in the most brutal ways. I'll use the example of some mystical thinkers who I cherish deeply to illustrate the common touchstone of death in exchange for an exploration of possible truth. First, years ago, I found myself crying to the story of Margaret de Porret, whose dialogue of the simple soul illustrated a claim to the ontological uniqueness of love that shattered my prior, analytically oriented, and conceptually empty accounts of the phenomena. In her work, Love has a personage, speaks to reason, and says, quote, "Now listen, reason, says love." This alarm is truly amazing. Yes. Quote, "Now listen, reason, says love. To understand better what you are asking about, a man who is on fire feels no cold. A man who is drowning knows no thirst. Now this soul, says love, is so burned in love's fiery furnace that she has become that very fire, so that she feels no fire, for in herself she is fire, through the power of love which has changed her into the fire of love." End quote. This reference to immolation, shockingly, seems to anticipate her own untimely end, where she, refusing to denounce as false her own work, was burned alive in fire stoked by intellectual fear. Her only threat to the world was that she was a genius, perhaps a situation unaided by her being a woman. But unlike so many in this world, she knew the experience of unadulterated and fearless freedom. Second, In another culture, the great Sufi thinker Al-Hallaj uttered the words "Ana-Allah," I am the truth, which ran the risk of teetering on a theory of apotheosis, which would be a strong claim to the possibility of the divinization of man. Of course, inherent in the most provocative statements inspiring world history, there's often an element of ambiguity. It may be the case that Al-Hallaj claimed to become divine, yet it may also be the case that he claimed to become nothing, erasing his own self to become a vessel for the divine. We may never know Al-Hallaj's intent because his life was terminated after a long confinement on trumped-up political and religious charges. But we in this room experience the transcendent blessing of a sacred reality, one of cinematic celebration. Whether it's the case of Jesus, Socrates, Margaret de Porret, Al-Hallaj, or another from the ocean of those sacrificed at the altar of thought, their breathing ideas prove you can kill a person, but you can't kill the truth. Their bravery, their intellectual revolution lives on. So now, if you will permit a broadening of the scope, I would like to offer the interlude of a personal encounter with raw fear and its implications for the types of death being a philosopher threatens upon those bodies who host their own thoughts. Admittedly, hi Lucy. Admittedly, if there's a passage you can zone out to without losing the point of the speech, it's the following story, which I share partially to reveal an analysis of the types of death, but mostly to underscore a solidarity between me and anyone who's ever stated the obvious and felt ignored, marginalized, or punished for it. In other words, I share this to add a visceral texture to the phenomena at stake. My testimony of the experiential content of what it's like, as Thomas Nagel would say, to feel you are about to be martyred, comes from a context so ambitiously implausible that I don't even expect you to believe I'm telling the truth, and yet I am. Some of you may recall that in 2018, a sequence of magnitude 6.4, 6.9, and 7 earthquakes devastated a small island in Indonesia called Lombok, destroying 80% of the buildings on the island. Well, I was there. And while the reasons are irrelevant, I was in a psych ward where the well-intentioned staff had a tendency to violent techniques to heal their patients. These included punching, choking, and involuntary bondage. Much of the building was wrapped around a crowded population with tiny barred windows through which you could hear perpetual pleas for liberty from the supposed patients or prisoners, depending on the language you prefer. When the earthquakes first started, it was transparently obvious to me that the building would soon collapse. So I yelled at the staff to quote unquote, liberate everyone immediately. And because they ignored me, I made the decision to grab a guard's cell phone and smash it on the ground. I was shortly thereafter strangled and dragged into the building, where they tied me by my wrists and ankles to a cot underneath a ceiling so fragile that as the earthquake continued, pieces of the ceiling fell on and around me. My life did not flash before my eyes, nor did I feel a grand sense of purpose, but rather an unambiguous fear flowed in waves through my body until the staff came in and asked if I had calmed down. And of course, I had. I was transferred to another psych ward in Bali almost immediately after this, which ended up saving my life because the hospital collapsed in the aftershocks of the quake. And to this day, I do not know whether those confined were evacuated or not. The reason I reference this phenomenology of fear is because the type of worry I had in that bed was not unfamiliar. The experience was on a continuum with those fears over abstract deaths, like social death, the death of hope, or perhaps most commonly for thinkers, financial death. So in the history and craft of philosophy, we play with everything. In too many cases, this includes our lives and our overarching well-being. And therefore, the opening questions I have, and they will constitute the following 2 sections, are twofold. First, why is the game so dangerous? Second, why play? Section 1, why is the game so dangerous? Before I sketch an image of the reasons why words are often met with swords, it's worth noting that the type of philosophy I have in mind is what I would call substantive thinking, as opposed to quote unquote cultured games. In cultured games, philosophy is a kind of toy or tool for the prestige Olympics, where citing already established, culturally celebrated thinkers is a mechanism to upgrade one's reputation, thereby portraying oneself as wise, sophisticated, bold, intelligent, and fundamentally worthwhile in virtue of one's mind, which indexes its thoughts to the safety of riding the wave of popular opinion, albeit doing so in an articulate manner. This is probably the most common abuse of a craft designed to liberate, because it reflects, in a sophist kind of way, mere bending of one's will to the appetite for status over truth. Substantive thinking, while not dangerous by necessity or definition, is the kind of thinking done with an indifference to status or prestige. It typically requires a devotion to the craft, steeped in a willingness to explore even those ideas that are considered culturally sacrosanct and irrefutable because their supposed truth value is indebted to repetition. An emerging consensus in cognitive science, known as the illusory truth effect, and confirmed in research by scientists like Dan Gilbert, Eric Mendelbaum, and even Professor Nicholas Porot, my more handsome and successful older brother, revolves around the reality that belief in the truth of a proposition has much more to do with repeated exposure than reasoning. In other words, merely seeing the same claim publicized over and over again increases the plausibility of it being true in one's mind, completely independent of the background evidence and reasons behind the claim. Thus, the most effective strategy for propaganda may involve some aesthetic and other types of considerations, but mostly should be concerned with repetition and exposure to the same claim ad nauseum. The brain, as a technology of the mind, is a simple beast that submits readily to such repetition, and therefore being willing to examine even those claims sanctified by extensive propaganda is a feature of substantive thinking. Needless to say, a complete definition embraces several broader elements to the craft, but perhaps my point is illustrated by acknowledging that Socrates and Diogenes are exemplars of the indifference to status required to do this type of philosophy. Though there are many beautifully revolutionary minds, not all of whom are famous, who've done it. In asking why substantive philosophy is so rare and punished, the most obvious answer is power. This well-charted angle relies on the fact that controlling what people think can be a way of controlling people themselves. State powers, religions, cults, and other structures of invested asymmetry tend to rely on myths and common consensus that structures a shared mental reality of a population. It's easy to establish examples of this kind, but some are more flagrantly hypocritical and absurd than others. For instance, Ruth Grant, a brilliant political scientist at Duke University, wrote on the ethics of hypocrisy and deceit about the famous American myth that Abraham Lincoln never told a lie. It sounds like a joke or a paradox because it's a lie designed to promote the value of truth. In other words, parents wittingly lie to their children with the false hope that the unwitting child will embrace the transcendent value of honesty as a reply to the obviously dishonest statement. But I would like to propose that the story of power does not exhaust an account of why substantive thinking can be so dangerous to its host. In other words, control is an incomplete explanation of what tethers people's perceived dignity and de facto safety, to ideas. In fact, I believe the best account of widespread distaste for thinking is a primarily existential one. By existential, I do not have in mind the particulars of that great tradition, including Kierkegaard and Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, but instead I have an elemental notion of people's basic identity being so wrapped up in their beliefs that they perceive challenging their thinking as an existential threat, a threat at the level of life and death. My theory of the relationships between persons and thoughts is mostly indebted to a throwaway footnote written in an essay about Berkeley nominalism by the luminous American pragmatist Charles Sanders Peirce, a shining star, along with Hilary Putnam and William James and others, from that very impressive hedge fund with an educational program, Harvard University. Peirce wrote, get ready for it. Just as we say that bodies are in motion and not that motion is in bodies, so too we ought to say that we are in thought and not that thoughts are in us. Elsewhere, he signaled that this means that thoughts possess us. We do not possess thoughts. So I think of thoughts as a kind of intoxicating force, similar to Simone Weil, when she contended that in an act of violence, there are two victims, the person against whom violence is exercised and the person who exercises the violence because they are intoxicated by force itself. To clarify, if you think of thoughts and ideologies, one second. As possessing addictive capacities and thereby possessing certain thinkers, then this would explain a lot. Most people encounter one powerful idea early in life, whether it be an economic or religious or other type of idea, and then they justify the remainder of their existence on the legitimacy of that theory. So what I'm campaigning for is that the mark of a true intellectual is not their love of ideas, but rather their resistance to the force of ideas, which enables them to entertain a plurality of ideas over the course of a lifetime, or the span of several seconds, without being immediately intoxicated and thus foreclosing on the possibility of intellectual growth based on their first encounter with a potent and well-articulated concept. Ironically, I believe we are kind of born this way, and a child's creative flexibility, their innate philosopher, loving the play of ideas rather than the somber dominance of a singular idea over their entire existence, is a capacity that, as my favorite philosopher of religion, the inimitable Charles Tolliver once said, quote unquote, is beaten out of us by society. I learned from the existentialist and ethicist Gordon Marino, who was a professional boxer before becoming a professional philosopher, that it's easier to take a punch to the face than a punch to the mind. So for those of you who are curious when play would emerge as essential to freedom in this probably surprisingly dark speech, it is now. We must be able to play with ideas and thereby conquer them rather than being conquered by them. What I mean by the constitutive elements of play here relies on the work we've done together through this term in defining the subject. But to rehearse how this is play, consider the two-pronged benefits of doing something for its own sake, for the intrinsic motivation, and further of slipping into a flow state of consciousness while doing it. I will sketch this, borrowing from the Theaetetus, as a kind of participation in the divine later. In other words, with play in mind, we must be able to embrace that wonderful Cartesian strategy of doubting all things and yet not doubting ourselves emotively, thus avoiding that critical pain that tends to be generated by intellectual suspicion. The answer to this riddle of how we doubt our ideas without doubting ourselves is actually embedded within the equation of the activity itself, because doubting yourself is a form of believing in yourself. The point can be clarified by a philosopher who reputedly generates more confusion than clarity, none other than Hegel. In response to the Kantian project of doubting our cognition, Hegel pointed out the impossibility of such an activity at the most general level, because doubt is obviously a form of your cognition, which is to say, when you doubt your cognition, you are simultaneously affirming it, because doubt is your cognition, maybe even the most powerful arm of your cognition. It is a recursive phenomenon. If you doubt yourself, then you are affirming yourself, and if you then doubt that, then you are affirming yourself at an even deeper level, and so on and so forth ad infinitum. It might be tempting to call this the paradox of doubt, but I personally have become slightly bothered by the exaggerated claims to paradoxes made by many philosophers. Notably, however, not by Professor Headley, in his appropriate claim to the paradox of serious play, of which this whole speech is an example. There are two types of paradoxes that shouldn't be conflated with each other. The first is a veridical paradox, where by definition or otherwise, there is an actual paradox embedded in the concept being displayed. Serious play counts here because seriousness and play are supposed to be mutually exclusive terms. By contrast, a falsitical paradox appears to be incoherent, but merely requires a quick unpacking to demonstrate the overall coherence of the superficial paradox. A great example of this would be something like the claim that a table is red and blue. If the whole table were red and blue entirely, and in the same space-time dimension, this might really be a paradox. But a simple unpacking of the claim in another condition could be that half the table is red and half the table is blue, and therefore the claim that the table is red and blue is perfectly coherent. To reference the earlier point of our philosophically imbued character as children, and it is well documented that these tiny logic games are much easier for children to figure out than adults, because our minds with time become conditioned to think of reality in a way that conflates empiricism and logic. I admit this is a detour, but we will return to the falsitical paradox of doubt momentarily. When asked, for instance, how to get to the moon with a paperclip, most adults say it's impossible, while children readily offer up the right answer. They say you need a really big paperclip stretching from Earth to the moon. And maybe this kind of impossible thinking is worth cherishing and preserving, especially in the form of doubting the seemingly undoubtable. Because obviously, while you doubt one part of your cognition, you affirm another. And perhaps deep self-awareness requires an embrace of the possibility that we are loving ourselves when we are doubting ourselves. In an exhilarating scene of the show Breaking Bad, Walter White, the protagonist who goes through his own fall into evil, exclaims, this is a theatrical moment, "I am not in danger. I am the danger." Maybe analogously, we could say, less theatrical, "I'm not in doubt. I am the doubter." Or if you prefer sustaining both roles, you can follow Ibn Arabi, who strikingly claimed to be both the lover and the beloved, the knight and the maiden. It would translate, in this case, to the doubter and the doubted. To summarize rather conclusive research on the subject carried out in the 1980s, foundational self-trust is integral to advanced cognition, even when displayed in the form of courageous doubt. Thus, to answer the opening question of why the game of real philosophy or substantive thinking can be so dangerous, I've tried to offer an atomized theory that accounts for individual motivations to be viscerally intolerant of those who challenge commonplace ideas. If Thomas Green, one of the most persuasive theorists of collective liberty, advanced the notion that society is a chemical equation in which all the parts infuse with each other to create something new, a level of analysis perfectly capable of offering descriptions of why the collective body might suppress individuals who are, as Plato said of Socrates, gadflies to the collective, I have argued that even at the level of the individual, there is a terrifying stubbornness of thought that makes the craft of challenging not only the whole body of society, but the component parts of it, the atomic level, a game for the brave. To do this in academic circles may be a highly vaulted and celebrated dignity, but to do as Socrates did, this very activity through approaching people on the streets and challenging their most cherished commitments through questions that unravel and stir doubt, requires a fearlessness that ought to be applauded even more than doing it in an environment where everybody knows the game and its relevant rules. Behind the belief in an idea, I have contended, there is the drunkenness of the one who proclaims it to be beyond scrutiny. So if at every level the play of philosophy is so risky, why play? Section 2, why play? Paralleling my attempt to escape the collective analysis of repression, I will in equal measure attempt to avoid a justification of martyred thinkers which is sacrificial in nature, avoiding all allusions to how their original or renewed commitments to ideas, innate and otherwise, contributes to the body of humanity. Instead, I will champion the notion that there is a singular blessing unlocked by substantive thinking, a gift belonging to those rare luminaries who go for it. And that, of course, is the highly cherished condition of personal liberation. The form this liberty takes, in my argument, is that most lethal of thoughts for which so many have been murdered. The belief, spelled out in logical analysis, that the power of God dwells in us. The pathway to this conclusion will be a binding of the will to follow logic to its final end, a craft even philosophers tend to deny. So think of the argument as a logical sketch, a game, and without further ado, let's play. Before sharing my classically heretical views, it's worth identifying that the veracity of liberation within the quasi-political realm is subject to much debate, with theories of the shape of freedom ranging from Isaiah Berlin's dichotomized negative and positive liberty, roughly spelled out as freedom from and freedom to, or Philip Petet's Republican theory of freedom has non-domination, even stretching to a theory of freedom as harmony between individual volition and its upswings within the social web, a theory of partially dependent freedom, which the philosopher Sharon Krauss sources first in that most noble of souls, the slave-turned-activist Frederick Douglass, and then in the widely popular thinker Hannah Arendt. Though I have a particular appetite in political arenas for that antinomy of servitude and liberation expressed in positive constructions of freedom, I will not be dancing around those more social and political portrayals of liberty as they so infrequently apply to the kinds of legendary thinkers whose lives are far too often terminated in squalor or exile or total annihilation. So what then can I propose as a theory of freedom, plausibly spiritual in nature? Borrowing from the Neo-Kantian tradition epitomized in the work of Christine Korsgaard and tracing a lineage that goes back to Socrates, I will try to sketch two relevant freedoms of the self set in contrast to each other as what I call transcendent liberation versus uncorked liberation. In transcendent liberation, reasoning or reasons are heralded as the arbiter of a kind of legislative procedure that passes through them, thus calibrating itself onto the degree of freedom experienced by the use of reason. Thus, rationality, as Kant himself would argue, is the springboard to the infusion of freedom and ethics that breathes this tradition. I call this kind of freedom transcendent because we, as embodied beings, carry passions and carnal instincts and other elements of existence which must be conquered or transcended for us to align ourselves with reason. This belongs to those cases that fall within the conflict models of appetite and reason, whose transcendence can be analogous to the transcendence of guilt, which Niebuhr articulates as follows, and which some of you have heard. Niebuhr argues guilt is transcendent because we are simultaneously taking ownership of our finitude, acknowledging ourselves as the one who behaved immorally, and yet condemning ourselves from an infinite moral landscape which stands beyond the tedious behavior we carry on daily. It helps here, and it will help in the following analysis, to deploy the language of a higher and lower self, which is to say that in the Niebuhrian transcendence, the lower self that we are is transcended by our higher selves, has expressed in that crucially painful, even if necessary, phenomena of guilt. There are models I could use to apply this to reason and the appetite, but I find the esteemed Frankfurt offers a useful and similar dichotomy in his invention of first and second order volitions. Roughly stated, a first order volition is a will towards whatever impulse or thoughtless goal immediately springs within our consciousness. A second order volition, one produced after reflection and sanctioned by rationality, would be that thing we will at an even more essential level than how much we will the first order volition. Under the conflict model, should there arise a disharmony between the two, we could loosely be described as enslaved to ourselves when the first order volition corrupts our capacity to act on the second, and yet free when the scenario is reversed. The first kind of unfreedom might be that unfreedom of Goethe's Faust, who voluntarily submitted to Mephistopheles in exchange for permitting him to indulge all the carnal delights and power he could ever want, an act designed to bring an end to carrying forward the aspirations that transform themselves into pain as he strove for a higher mind and an ethical life. Transcendence by reverse engineering would be just the opposite. If a gambler with a rabid appetite for continued games leaves the casino, not because he wants at one primary level, but because he wants at the next stage in this duplex theory of the mind, then he has transcended his lower volitions by his higher ones. Reasoning and reasons are not unimportant, nor hollow and empty illusions, as they remain significant instruments of human advancement. However, personally, this speech is shaped by the morally infamous philosopher David Hume, who pointed out that this theory of the sovereignty of reason must wrestle with his claim that reason is and always will be, quote unquote, a slave of the passions. An instrument, in other words, that creates the form of justification for whatever direction our passions guide us. Along these lines, the valorization of reason has been called into question by two thinkers from radically different orientations who ultimately claim the same flaw of the calculating mind. One of Britain's greatest writers, G.K. Chesterton, and one of France's most celebrated psychoanalysts, Jacques Lacan. For both of them, reasoning, exaggerated as it is in value, is actually the spring of psychosis or madness. Lacan illustrates the point by discussing how it is not the absence of rationality that forms the psychotic mind, but rather the presence of hyper-rationality. Nothing can be random in this type of mind. If a red car passes by, then it cannot be random that the car was red, but must fold into a broader theory, usually a conspiracy, about how the red car and the opened window and the other random elements collaborate to create a coherent and necessary story about what is happening around its perceiver. In orthodoxy, by extension, G.K. Chesterton suggested that if you want to know where reason truly is a sovereign, then you must go to the madhouse. Try arguing with a man condemned by hyperreason, and you shall never win. It is the loosening of reason, and not the introduction to it, which returns us into sanity. Now, as a detour before translating this critique into a campaign for uncorked freedom, I must rather acknowledge that what I'm about to say sounds similar to madness anyway. And here I have to confess, the possibility of madness does not constitute a terrifying critique for me or my preference, in the same way that it would internally challenge lovers of reason who perceive the craft as hypersanity. Walter Kuster's recent work on the difference between madness and mysticism, vocalized in the chapter called Psychotica Mystica of the book A Philosophy of Madness, addresses the phenomenology of mystical and mad states being irreducibly similar in content, though distinguished from each other only in the overarching functionality of the user of these states of consciousness. Which is to say, the mystic may eat, sleep, and function at a biological level, while the madman, making comparable claims to divinity, might be failing to function at such a level. And thus, though a digression, I'd like to remind the audience that psychiatrists should never become thought police, because most philosophers would then be locked up. But if the violence of the craft finds justification, I hope it's limited to bodily health measured in the biological functionality of the host of abnormal thoughts. And even then, with cases like the Jain religion or Carolyn Walker Bynum's Holy Feast and Holy Fast, in which some mystically starve themselves to death, the manner becomes all the more complicated. So this, not being a commentary on the whole field of mental health, where safety of others and such considerations might triumph, must be a philosophical rampage limited uniquely to its role in permitting intellectual freedom. So what is uncorked liberation? Or to begin, the uncorking process. It is a term I invented, has the antithesis of the well-traced psychological phenomena of triggering, where triggering is an involuntary negative psychophysical response to stimulus. In the real cases, it is induced by trauma and typically involves negative thoughts and feelings pouring forth over the irritated host. Uncorking is the exact opposite. It would be the fourth pouring of the champagne of the soul, as the bottle is uncorked by a stimulus, like a natural landscape or great poem or question, which allows us to experience our real selves beyond what we had previously thought we were. In other words, though the metaphysics of this will be addressed shortly, I do not believe reason, and reason alone, sets us free. My intuition is that the love of reasoning, which I also cherish, has more to do with the love of some kind of authentic, real, or higher self, requiring a metaphysics of the divided soul that has largely become unpopular in the archetype of secular worldviews displayed in contemporary philosophical thinking. Ultimately, it doesn't suffice for me that a reason we spend more time thinking about is more likely to be a reason our will aligns with so powerfully as to trivialize the carnal appetite it opposes or sanctions. The authentic or real understanding of what constitutes a human being allows for a harmony of appetite, passion, and reasoning, so that the ensemble, when unlocked, which is rare, sets a human free. To illustrate the point before the metaphysics, I have found an articulation of the phenomena of a lukewarm relationship to our authentic selves, a metaphysically rich and compelling one, in the unlikely work of that demigod poet of Los Angeles, Charles Bukowski. Thus, I will read and analyze the poem before beginning to wrap this section and thereby the whole speech. The poem is called Bluebird. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay in there. I'm not going to let anybody see you. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I pour whiskey on him and inhale cigarette smoke. And the whores and the bartenders and the grocery clerks never know that he's in there. There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too tough for him. I say, stay down. Do you want to mess me up? You want to screw up the works? You want to blow my book sales in Europe? There's a bluebird in my heart that wants to get out, but I'm too clever. I only let him out at night, sometimes when everybody's asleep. I say, I know that you're there, so don't be sad. Then I put him back, but he's singing a little in there. I haven't quite let him die. And we sleep together like that with our secret pact. and it's nice enough to make a man weep, but I don't weep, do you? I don't weep either, for what it's worth, but I do long to let the bluebird out. Bukowski's own lines indicate that he hosts something which he himself suppresses, the sweet and beautiful bluebird. But at least he's kept it alive and it forms his character, perhaps singing in those life-altering poems he writes and sometimes publicly read while drinking himself into a stupor. I know this experience, and I don't believe I'm alone in knowing this experience. But to make sense of how unlocking the bluebird from its cage within us is freedom, some quick allusions to a robust metaphysics of causation are necessary. To begin with, I'm aligned with Hobbes definitionally when he contends that the terms freedom and power are substitutes for each other, which is to say, though of course I'm not addressing power over others, the mere notion of power to accomplish something is precisely what we mean when we say freedom at the individual level. Another allusion to this would be the Cartesian claim that we are a dominion within a dominion. In a world where everything has a cause, to be free is to be a cause unto ourselves. Now, the complex history of how easy it is to deny causal efficacy from a logical perspective, one falsely attributed to Hume, would seem to undermine this whole discussion. But let's look at the Cartesian genius, Malebranche, who, in the heritage of several great Islamic occasionalists, designed the very arguments Hume reproduced to deny the inherent logic of causal efficacy. Unlike Hume and the tradition of confused philosophers attempting unsuccessfully to offer analytically necessary definitions of causation, Malebranche did believe there was, in fact, one logically necessary definition of causation, which is, and I quote, or sort of quote, causation is the relationship between an omnipotent will and its upshots. In other words, causal efficacy flows out of the concept of power as the effects of an all-powerful will. Subsequently, if freedom or causal efficacy requires an omnipotent will, then the question remains as to how we, as feeble and broken beings, could possess it. There are at least two options. First, as Malebranche might contend, an omnipotent agent assents to our thoughts and gives them causal efficacy by enacting them within the otherwise controlled world. But in my opinion, this only begs the question as to what exactly causes the thoughts themselves, thereby closing down the possibility of free thought generating assisted free action. Instead, another sketch, which will sound implausible to most aside from those Sufis among us, an argument so Sufi-esque, I would love to pair it with dervish dances, would be to acknowledge that the bluebird Bukowski writes about is either a god within or God herself. It's worth noting Socrates and Aristotle justify a life of the mind on the basis that it makes us like the gods. Socrates in the digression with Theodorus in the Theaetetus, and Aristotle in section 7, chapter 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Even the atheist Socrates says, when discussing freedom, that the fundamental human project is to be God. The purpose of this in my work is to say that we must have omnipotent or demi-power within us to logically hold on to our own freedom, hence the language of a God within. Hafez, the legendary Persian Sufi poet, who ambiguously seduces his readers into the enchantment of pure love, articulates the opening of a God within very clearly when he describes the cracking of a seed in his soul in a short poem worth reading. He says, in his typically playful way, the following. It used to be that when I would wake in the morning, I could with confidence say, what am I going to do? That was before the seed cracked open. Now Hafez is certain. There are two of us housed in this body, doing the shopping together in the market and tickling each other while fixing the evening's food. Now when I awake, all the internal instruments play the same music. Quote, God, what love mischief can we do for the world today? Translation by Daniel Ladinsky. Freedom, by extension, is a mystical experience because it connects our will with omnipotence in a way that strikes the peculiar ambiguity of Al-Hallaj's claim to being the truth. We must, if we care to defend human freedom, be open to theories of apotheosis or theosis, both of which require that undeniably unpalatable concept in modern society, which the greatest scholar of mysticism, Evelyn Underhill, calls spiritual alchemy. The stratagems and techniques to uncork the God within cannot be traced in the confines of this speech, but I hope I've illustrated that beyond political freedom, the philosopher who devotes themselves to the inner delight of inquiry can conceivably infuse themselves with a divine potency expressed as our playful, loving, authentic selves. Because, as Margaret de Pret claimed, we do not merely burn in the flames of love, but become that very fire of love itself. I dream, I pray, I beg to either erase myself so that only God breathes through me, or otherwise undergo an apotheosis so that I am the truth. But whatever my personal journey amounts to, this whole speech is an ode to those who sacrifice their finitude, sometimes in the brutal hands of others, for an infinite freedom. To summarize, here's the SparkNotes version. 1, philosophy, real philosophy, is actually quite dangerous. 2, it's dangerous partially because people have a tendency to conflate their true identity with their unexamined ideas. 3, this mistaken sense of self might be solvable through the play of philosophy, a play rich with inherent value, with the upswing of a possible uncorking process, unleashing our true selves. 4, that true self within us might just be God, or something very similar to God. So now it has come to time to part ways with this long construction of a rhetorically infused case for liberation through our innate playfulness. I'd like to remind those thinkers in the room on their own journey of 2 things. First, it is far less important that you agree with me than that you play with me. Second, standing in solidarity with the journey of thought, I know the road can be winding and terrifying as we subject ourselves to perpetual judgment from above, as we sacrifice carnal appetites and yet fall into traps of prestige and power. And in our trembling imperfection and relative poverty proportional to our skills, we may never fully know deep liberation. But I still think the cause is worth fighting for, even dying for, not because of what we might contribute to humanity, though it is ample, but rather because in those dark, solemn, and lonely literary nights, there's a chance we stumble upon a miraculous opening, an uncorking, or a reality beyond reality. So if asked to summarize the whole speech in 3 words, then I would first and foremost address it to those who have embraced a life of the mind, and acknowledge that I inherited the wisdom of this phrase from 2 unparalleled prophets of the hood, Snoz and Snoop Dogg. Play on, playa. Thank you.